All right, so I started the recording. Welcome, everybody. This is the monthly webinar for the Instructional Design and Learning SIG. We do have free monthly webinars for our members. We consider that to be a benefit of membership. And this month, September, we are learning from Chuck Campbell. Chuck actually volunteered for this webinar. He didn't have to be voluntold, and we really appreciate him. Now, if you guys don't know Chuck yet, you're going to really like him. He's very friendly. He sounds nothing like somebody who's from New York, although you are from the Rochester area. Is that right?
Well, Rochester chapter. I live in Canastota, which is near Syracuse.
Right, and you
It's
don't.
the Syracuse accent that comes
Yeah,
through.
you don't sound like it at all. So, but you need to get on Google and Google Chuck Campbell Ninja Talk and find his Ninja Talk. He created a great Ninja Talk for Ben Welk to present, and then Ben Welk at the Spectrum Conference created a great Ninja Talk for Chuck to present. So it's actually really, really funny. So everybody go Google and find it. So Chuck, anytime you are ready, we are really excited about your presentation. I think a lot of us do presentations, and we do have handouts that people just kind of take back to their desk and ball up in a ball. So maybe
We'll
you can
find
help us
that
out.
out.
Yep.
Okay. Well, first thing, thank you, Vicky, for promoting and setting this up and hosting the webinar, and another thanks to all the IDL SIG folks that I work with and meet up at the summit conference. I've gotten a lot of help from all you guys, and I appreciate it. I joined the SCC Rochester chapter, I don't know, maybe 4 years ago, and joined the IDL SIG just a few years after that, and got some good tips and guidance from everybody. If you saw my, I guess my bio, I've been in the business about 25 plus years. I've done, I don't know how many thousands of presentations of all types at big companies. I worked for a company called GP Strategies, and we were a training company. Now I work at the New York Power Authority, and I work with actually one of the people on the call, Jerry Tallarico, in the training department, and we do a lot of the e-learning and also instructor-led training. And so we do have a lot of presentations out there, and sometimes you give handouts. And I've created a lot of good and bad handouts in my time. Like Vicki said, I kind of volunteered for this, to do this webinar. I have no idea why, but I volunteered to do this webinar because just like lots of people, you go to a presentation and they give you a handout and you look at it and you're thinking, wow, I've got something to start my fire pit in the backyard now. And trust me, I've given my share of those out. So hopefully what I want to do, although the title says, to create presentation handouts that people will actually use, I should have called it, create presentation handouts that I hope people will actually use, because a lot of this is my own opinion. I've done a little bit of, informal research and find out what other people in the industry are doing for handouts, and you get mixed results. So here's my take on it. I will reference some of the people who I thought have done really good handouts or know how to do handouts. I will not mention the people that do bad ones. So if you're looking for that, no. And hopefully we'll get some out of this. So anybody have any questions before we get started? No? Okay. Well, I guess my first question is, a rhetorical question is, why do we provide handouts at presentations? What's the purpose of them? Like when you go to when you go to a presentation, most people expect to be given a handout. Some people do not. But as Vicki was talking earlier, what do you do with the handout after the presentation? Do you take it home and use it for reference? You throw it in the trash can? Do you read it during the presentation? And does it depend on what the handout, how good it is or not?
Melissa has answered your rhetorical question.
Oh, what's your answer, Melissa?
To help people remember your points, it says.
Help people remember your point. That's a good point. Yeah. A lot of it to help people remember the point, and we will get into other reasons why people would give out a handout and why people would use the handout. But I'm going to start off with the fact that there are different types of presentations, and the question I have is, does your presentation even need a handout? Some presentations don't need handouts, and some presentations don't even require slides. Now, here's a good example of a talk. A popular guy in the industry. Some people refer to him as the presentation god, Seth Godin. I think he coined the term. There should be no more than 6 words per slide ever. But as doing some of my informal research, I found out that somebody had asked Seth Godin one time if he could have his slides at the end of the presentation, and they said there was you could hear a pin drop in the auditorium. And he said, I don't send people my slides. He said, without me, you wouldn't have any idea what they mean. I am your guide. So he basically says he don't hand out his slides because they're worthless. And to quote Rick Altman, he's another famous presenter. He basically points out the fact that if you have good slides for a presentation, they do not make good handouts. If you have good handouts, they do not make good slide presentations. And I stand by that. And that's kind of what the meaning of this whole webinar is going to be about. And I do think it's ironic, though, that some of Seth Godin's presentations are on SlideShare. Does anybody here go on SlideShare? So he may not hand the slides out, but you can find them sometimes. Other presentations that you might see that do not require handouts or do not require slides. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of Sir Ken Robinson. He did a presentation for TED Talk back in February 2006 on education. Again, not only did he not have handouts, he did not have slides, and his presentation was excellent. And the reason why I thought his presentation was excellent is because it was all about the story. It was not about how good your slides were. It was not about how good your handouts were. There's that. So now let's talk about other presentations where you might require handouts. Okay, and there's different types of presentations. When we talk to a lot of people, we go to these conferences. It's all about usually a conference training presentation. It can be on new technology or new tools you can use for TechCom. But there's other types of presentations out there, like, for example, student lectures. Okay. What would you do with a handout in a student lecture? So some, instructors or professors, they may hand out reference material or homework or some type of research material that the students are going to use to go back and do research with. Okay, that's one type of a handout you might see. Another type may be sales presentations. Okay, what kind of handouts can you see in a sales presentation? Product information, reference information. It can be competitor comparison sheets. It can be pricing sheets like the one we see on the screen now.
Cat.
So someone like Jamie may want to buy her cat a bonnet. Who knows, right? We even give discounts. You can get $2 for a cat bonnet and 2 for $5. So there's another type of presentation you can give. Okay, engineering reviews is another one. Like an engineering review, you can have research material that you hand out during the presentation, plant specifications, drawings, whether it's mechanical or electrical drawings or procedures. Those are other types of handouts. And technical training, which me and Jerry Tallarico do a lot. What types of handouts would you have there? It can also be procedures, drawings, student guides. Now, a lot of times when you get handouts at conferences, the handouts could be just a handful of sheets of paper. A handout can also be a student guide that could be 150 pages long or 200 pages long. Even though we call them student guides, I call them student novels because a guide should really guide you through the course. Other ones are quick reference cards to reference things like procedures and formulas, mathematical formulas. I've seen all kinds. And I know a lot of people here are probably thinking, well, I thought this was going to be about conference presentations, but These are other presentations I'm sure some of us have given. Any questions so far on the types of presentations we're going through? Comments or anything? No?
There's several comments about the cat and the cat bonnet.
Okay, the cat. Oh, we do. Who's got the comment about the cat and the cat bonnet? Okay.
I was just going to say that I think it's good that you're referencing those other types.
Okay. Oh, thank you.
I like that. I'm glad that you're going over several different ones.
Oh, thank you. So speaking of which, the popular one, I guess, a lot of people on the call are used to are the conference presentations. What types of handouts could you possibly get at conference presentations? The types that I have seen have been best practices, certain takeaways, pretty much the main points of the presentation, and they summarize that up in a handout. New concepts, leadership tips. If you go to leadership presentations, we've been actually given actual software. If anybody's ever gone to an Adobe workshop at a conference, they give you a thumb drive. And on that thumb drive, you not only have reference material, you have software, trial software, because they want you to buy their product. And I think that's a really good idea. You know, somebody like us may or may not want to spend money on 80 different thumb drives to pass around. But that is another example. I've actually seen a handout before where the handout page had a QR code on it. Those who are not familiar with a QR code, you scan it, it takes you to a website or a URL that actually has a reference material out there that you can download. So that way they don't waste printing for people who are going to throw them away. So the people who are going to use the handouts are people who really want it and they print it themselves. There's another example. But I've seen questionnaires, checklists, and more details on the slides. And a lot of times you see the speaker's notes. And we'll get to that in a second, where you get your handouts of their speaker's notes. I disagree with that idea, but there could be cases where it may make sense to some people. Okay. And as we continue on about our different types of presentations, we give presentations at meetings sometimes. What would you hand out? Meeting agendas, last meeting's minutes, task lists, project updates, you name it. And last but not least on my list of presentations are like workshops. Some of the things I've seen given out at workshops are procedures, forms, case studies, even role-playing guidelines, depending upon what the workshop is about. Because workshops are usually meant to teach you a new skill or a task or whatever. Does anybody have any questions so far since I'm blazing through here pretty fast on the different types of presentations? And did anybody have any that I did not mention? The type of presentations.
So there is a comment in the chat from Mary Ann.
Okay.
She says one useful handout is a bibliography or a list of other resources. Good point.
Oh, good point. Bibliography, and in other words, where did you get your data from, your research data from, right? Yes, that's a good one. Thanks, Marianne. So anyway, assume you're attending a presentation, like maybe like this one, but you're not going to get handouts for this one, sorry. But if you come to my presentation at SCC New England Interchange, I might have handouts for that one. But anyway, you go to a presentation or you're giving a presentation, and all at once somebody asks you for your slides, and you get that look on your face because you don't want to give them your slides, right? So what do, right? Or even better yet, they ask for your handouts. Well, what if you don't have any handouts? Do you feel guilty about it or not guilty about it? It all depends on what the presentation's about. Remember, not all presentations require handouts. And I can tell you right now from my experience, if you're going to give a bad handout, don't give a handout, okay? Handouts, in my opinion, should be specifically intended for the purpose that you want to hand them out for. Don't just hand them out because you feel guilty and I didn't have time to make handouts. I want to give everybody my slides, okay? So let's say you decide to give a handout and you give the handout and That's the response you get sometimes when you give a handout. Anybody ever got that response? And you wonder why you even gave them out? No?
Well, at least she's
Um,
looking at it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. At least she's looking at it. And also, sometimes when we give handouts, we'll get into this in a second about whether you should give the handout before, after, or during the presentation. So sometimes you can give a handout and you may lose your audience altogether. So if your presentation is boring, hopefully this one's not yet, or if your handouts are terrible, next thing you know, you look over and you see somebody on their phone and they're doing something completely different than what's going on in the presentation. Okay, this does not apply to those people who are tweeting how wonderful the presentation is. Okay, that's okay. But again, if you hand a handout at the wrong time, or it's got the wrong information, or it's got too much information, you could possibly lose your audience, in my opinion. Okay, and believe it or not, yes, I've given my share of bad handouts, and I continue to give my share of bad handouts, but I'm trying my best to improve. Okay. So why do we seem to give bad handouts? Is it a lack of time, a lack of devotion, a lack of experience, or do we really even care about our audience when we're giving them out, or we're trying to toot our own horn? Well, I'm here to say you should care about your audience, because that's the only reason you're there giving the presentation. So I'm hoping that somebody gets something out of this presentation. So now you've decided to give handouts. Okay. Now you decide to give handouts. I typically ask myself 3 basic questions. And from my informal research, I see the same basic questions asked out there. How are you going to create the handouts? What information is going to be in the handouts? And do you hand them out before, after, or during the presentation? Okay, and that's some of the things I'm going to discuss today. Okay, let's talk about creating handouts first. Okay, some of the best practices around: use the all famous PowerPoint. Okay, you can create your handouts right inside PowerPoint. Okay, if you're not using PowerPoint to do your presentation, that's fine. You can use other presentation software, or you may not even use PowerPoint. But if you do use PowerPoint, they do make handout material for PowerPoint. Okay, and everybody in the industry, including myself, always recommend against just printing your slides and passing your slides around during the presentation. Okay, but why do we still do it? Why do we still do it? Okay, so anyway, Microsoft, to fix this problem, they built this wonderful and sometimes awful tool into PowerPoint that helps us create our presentations. Like, has anybody ever done the notes pages or the handout pages? This is an actual handout that you could be given. Okay, has anybody ever received a handout like this in their presentations?
I have, yes.
Yeah. And so what did you do? Did you go, awesome, I got everything that they're going to talk about? Right?
Yep.
Probably not, right? So if you didn't want to give handouts like this, Microsoft also has this awesome tool built in that you can come in and you can print your full slides, that you can print notes pages, an outline, and the all familiar handouts where you can put anywhere from 1 slide to 9 slides on a page, like we just saw. And just remember my previous example, the notes pages people tend to use a lot, and we'll talk about the notes pages in just a second here. The notes pages can be your friend or they can be your enemy. And I'll give you an example of the notes pages that I did one here. I used the notes pages in this example here for my own speaker notes, so to speak. I did not hand these out. Okay, but if you're going to hand this out, I dug into it, and lots of people in the industry, lots of the industry experts recommend handing out your notes pages with your speaker notes on there. I tend to disagree with that. We've had people say, okay, hand out your notes pages, but leave the part where the notes are blank so people have space to write. I typically do not like to do that because if they're writing, they're not listening to your presentation. Okay, if that makes any sense. And the default notes pages, in my opinion, is a bad idea. A lot of people do not know that you can actually edit the notes pages and make them look totally different than the default notes page. If we have time, we can get into, I can maybe show you how to do one. But anyway, there's that right there. Let me see. Any questions on the, did anybody here use the notes pages for their handouts? You got a little, we tried to do the polling things earlier, but it didn't work too well for us. Okay.
Yeah, we won't do that again.
Yeah, we won't do it again. Yeah, it crashed. It crashed the webinar. So anyway, okay. So I see a lot of people that have used the notes pages, but not for handouts. That most people use them for their speaker's notes. Sometimes you use them like I'm doing right now, where you do the presentation view or the presenter view, where you can see your notes. If you do have notes, try not to read them to the audience. This is not a webinar on making really good slides. That's a totally different webinar, and hopefully Robert will cover all that about not putting paragraphs on your slides. But even if you put paragraphs on your notes pages, don't read those paragraphs to the people. Some of the things that we decide, okay, what do we want to put on the handouts? If you have, and again, I'm going to quote Rick Altman, who runs the presentation summit that's coming up in a couple of days in Clearwater, Florida. If anybody's not signed up to go, I'm jealous if you are, because my wife's going. But one of his famous sayings is that there are three things you need to consider when you do a presentation. Number one is what you show. Number two is what you say. And number three is what you give. Okay, what you show should be different than what you say, and that all should be different than what you give. In other words, your slides should not look like your handouts, and your handouts should not look like your slides, and you should not read either one of them to the audience, okay? Because you are supposed to be the presentation, not the actual slides, okay? So what should go in your handouts? So typically what should go in your handouts is something that supports what's in the presentation, okay? And what I mean by what supports in the presentation, there are different views of what that means. For example, if I'm giving a presentation on a new type of software, I don't want to put all the specification on the screen. I may want to put short points about it and then put the details into the notes pages that I'm going to hand out as the handout. That's one example. Another example could be, let's say you're doing some type of presentation where you're required the audience to answer questions. You don't want to put every question on all the slides. You can do the handout, and you can discuss the questions during the presentation while they're going through the questions in their handouts. And I'll give an example of that later. But the bottom line is the handouts should support or enhance the presentation, not replace it so that they're reading your handouts while you're actually trying to talk. Okay. There's other questions about handouts is when you're creating the handout, are you going to create it just for the people who are attending the presentation, or do you want the handout to also be delivered to people who were not able to attend? Okay, so there could be a possibility of creating two different types of presentations, one for your handout for people who are there and one for people who are not there. I don't do that because if I give a handout, I want it to be for people who are there and people who are not there. If you're not at the presentation, then you didn't get all the you didn't get everything the speaker said. That's a totally different thing. It's more like a document as opposed to a presentation you're giving them. Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you a question about that?
Yes.
Just to make sure I understand. So you're saying if someone couldn't attend, you would create a separate document, or you would not give them a document at all because they weren't able to attend the presentation?
The question is if somebody were not able to attend the presentation, would I not give them anything, or would I give them a separate document? Some of the industry experts say that give them a separate document, and it would create two different presentations. what I'm disagreeing with, or what I do differently, is I would create one presentation, and my presentation will be the slides that I show, like you're seeing now, which is not really a lot of text on it. But if I were to hand this out, my handout would be a notes page that I created specifically for people who did not attend. Does that make sense?
I understand. Yes,
Okay.
thank you. That makes sense.
Because if I'm not there to describe what this slide means, my presentation handout that I would give to somebody who was not there should pretty much speak to the point I'm trying to make with that slide. Okay, if that makes any sense. And again, I can show you examples of what my speaker notes look like at the end of the presentation here for this particular webinar I'm doing now, just to show you what they look like. But anyway, so a key thing too that comes up is the biggest discussion I've seen out on the wiki boards and all the blogs is, do you give them the handout out before or at the beginning of a presentation, during the presentation, or after the presentation? And I read through multiple documents where everybody said they had their research, college research about how it's best to give them out at the beginning of the presentation to give people the right notes and give them the reference. And then others say they got industry research where you give them out at the end of the presentation because you don't want to distract the audience. And then you got the ones who say give it out during. And I agree with Rick Altman. It all depends on the presentation. Okay, like for example, if I'm going to do a presentation on like a technical presentation on going through electrical schematics or mechanical drawings, I hand those drawings out at the beginning, and I get to control when, where, and why they look at the handouts. So we go through those schematics or those diagrams during the presentation, and I hand them out at the beginning. An example of when I would do it during the presentation is if I'm doing a workshop and we're getting ready to do some type of a role playing or some type of a case study. You hand them out at the time you start the role playing or you start the case study or you discuss the case study. And they're mainly for the ones that after the presentation, personally, I give them out is if there's going to be checklists or summary data for what the presentation was about, or quick reference guides, stuff that you really don't want them watching or reading while you're talking. You can give those out after. So again, it's going to depend on the presentation, and the only person who can determine that is the speaker, in my opinion. Okay. Any questions, comments on when you would hand these things out, or? Cool. Oh, I heard somebody. Okay. So I'm going a lot faster than I kind of wanted to go, but it's okay. Nobody's got a lot of questions. So I guess everybody's wondering by now, so when am I going to show some examples, right? I have some examples in here of presentation handouts, and I'll start with one of mine. Okay. So what was the presentation? It was a progression that we did at the Rochester Spectrum Conference in 2016. What this handout was for, I gave at the end of it. And what the progression was is we sat around and we talked about the different types of adult learning principles at work. It's obvious in the title, right? I talked about the different types of the key discussion items. After I got done talking about all the discussion items, I gave this as a walk away from the or takeaway from the progression. I did find, believe it or not, that the more colorful your handout, the more people's eyes seem to glow when you hand it to them. If you hand them a blank white sheet of paper with black text on it, it may be the best information in the world, even better than what I have here, but their eyes still seem to glow when you see colors. And if you laminate it, you just won over a new audience. Trust me. Okay?
So shiny, colorful.
People love laminated colored things for some reason. Okay. And another example of one of the things that I'd handed out here is, believe it or not, this was just my own speaker notes for myself. And when somebody saw it, they wanted to know if they could have a copy of it. So I had to go make copies of this for them because they wanted it to take away. Now, did they take it home and use it for kindling? I don't know. But I had several people who asked for that handout, and I really think it's because it was colorful. But that was not initially intended to be a handout. So these were handed out at the end of my presentation. One that was handed out at the beginning of a presentation is I do electrical troubleshooting training at New York Power Authority, and I'm teaching electrician apprentices, and we're getting ready to go over how motor control circuits work and how other control circuits work. So I hand this out at the beginning of the presentation or the class, and then we talk about what's going on in the schematic. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the electrical schematics or not, but this is the one that you would see. Here's another one. I know it looks kind of fancy, but it's not as hard as it looks. I hand this out at the beginning, and we talk about how the system works. And again, I hand out at the beginning of the presentation. Okay. Once we go through and understand how the system works in my presentation, then we decide to troubleshoot and break the system. And we get ready to break the system. We get ready to start troubleshooting. I hand this out during the presentation or during the class so that we can actually start learning how to troubleshoot electrical faults. And then when we get into the electrical faults, I have what we call a 7-step troubleshooting procedure that I stole from the Navy. And this is where they actually have to fill out the boxes. Up in here where it says step 1, step 2, as we're going through and actually doing hands-on troubleshooting in the class, they actually have to fill these out. And as they're filling these out, I'm tracking what they're writing down so I can track the progress of how well they're doing during their troubleshooting. So that's another form of presentation that is totally different than a conference presentation. But the handouts that were actually being used live during the presentation. Any questions on that one or no?
So
Okay.
Chuck, do you collect
Yeah.
those then to get feedback on how well they're learning, or?
I actually grade them on how well they're troubleshooting. So a good example is when we go through the steps, the symptom recognition, elaboration. As we're going through the steps, I actually have them write down what the symptoms were or what the elaboration part is. Just a little too detailed to cover in this webinar, but and then what the probable faulty functions are. If they list a ridiculous faulty function, okay, then I can stop at that point right there and say, okay, you might want to go back and look at this. Go back and look at the electrical prints and see if this can really be a problem. And a good example of that is in an electrical system, you have a control circuit and you have a power circuit. If the symptom is obviously in the power circuit but not in the control circuit, and they list something in the control circuit as part of the faulty function, I can say, hey, in other words, I can track what their progress as they're going along in the class. So this is more like a student type presentation or student lecture presentation. But even if you're doing a presentation at a conference, like for example, Adobe shows you how to use FrameMaker or whatever. A lot of times, you're going through these steps of setting up documents and changing and formatting documents. And you could create some type of handout in a way, if it's a small enough class, that you could walk around and you can see if they're following along properly. So that's an example I use there. Another example of a handout that was handed, kind of during the presentation was an awesome presentation at Leadership Day that Ben Welk, Carolyn Kelly Klinger, and Jamie Gillenwater did on planning for successful succession. This is a leadership thing. So what they have here is a lot of planning tips that they handed out. And then after that, they handed out a questionnaire. And this was a takeaway. So when you go back to your chapters after you leave Summit, these are questions that you could ask yourself or ask people in your chapter. What do we need to do to enhance our leadership skills and get more leaders to come into the chapter? Okay. So one of those was, were handed out during the presentation, and this could be as a takeaway to leave afterwards. I thought this was a really good one. Okay. And again, like I said in the beginning, a lot of these are my opinions of what I thought good handouts are. There are thousands and thousands of good handouts, and there are thousands of bad ones. The key point I'm trying to make is don't print your slides and hand them out and call it a handout. Another excellent handout, I thought, was a presentation at Leadership Day at Spectrum this year. Cindy Curry, she did a leadership presentation on what type of leader am I. And this was a self-assessment worksheet, and she broke the different types of leaders down into animals and animal types. And if you look here, these are the different traits of these types of animals. And you actually have to check the box and answer whether or not you think you have these traits. And so at the end, you end up finding out which type of leader are you. Are you a meerkat? Are you a, I think that's a rhino at the top. Are you a rhino? So as you go through there, you actually, live during the presentations, you're figuring out what type of leader you are. So I thought that was an excellent handout because it actually shows you skills that you have or need to improve upon right there during the presentation. Okay.
So I have a question about this one.
Yeah.
So would they, on the previous slide, when they had those different leadership types, and you said that they would be picking that as they go through the presentation. Does the presentation specifically allow time to do this? Because this is where my concern comes in, that this is very attractive to me. I would want to look at the pictures and read through that, and I would totally miss the presentation that was happening.
That's a good point. Because so what Cindy had done is the presentation was about an hour long, and maybe 40 minutes into it, she handed this out and said, okay, now let's see what kind of leader you are. So the last 20 minutes was dedicated solely to going through this and helping people identify their leadership type.
Oh, okay.
So this was kind of, when I say during, it was kind of like, it wasn't when people were walking out the door, but it was the end of her presentation, her slides, and she handed this out and discussed it at the end of the presentation. And it was up to the attendees whether or not they wanted to do it right there on the spot and say, hey, look, Cindy, I'm a meerkat, or can they take it away and go home and say, oh, I want to take the time to think about this one. So that was a good question, because that's a good point. If you hand this out at the very beginning of the presentation, I'm not going to hear a word Cindy said. I'm going to be looking through this thing going, hey, I got some cool pictures and I'm going to check some boxes. So this would be a bad one to hand out at the very beginning. And again, it all keys into when do you hand it out. Does that kind of answer your question, or?
Yes, it absolutely does. That helps me understand how it was used.
Okay.
And it's so almost more of an activity handout, which that makes a lot of sense. I like that.
Correct. And again, too, what I've seen is what I may think is a good handout during a presentation, the person sitting next to me may think it's the worst thing they've ever seen. So the challenge of the speaker is to figure out what kind of handout is going to work. Is it, and the speaker really should know the best what message they're trying to get across, but sometimes it's just a potluck chance, because you may have that person sitting there that wants your slides, and that's what they did, is want your slides. Because if you don't hand them your slides, they seem offended that you didn't give them the slides. Even if you give them a handout, they still want your slides. And that happens at every conference I've ever gone to. Even if you give a handout like this, people still want your slides. And I don't know why. But anyway, so here's, those are just some examples. And again, these were kind of like the takeaways. The page 2 and 3 were takeaways. Here's another one at the progression that Kelly Schrank did at the 2014 Spectrum Conference, and it was pretty much a communicating with others. It pretty much gave, Kelly, if you can pipe in here, you could probably describe it better than I can. But this handout I thought was really well done, because what it looks to me like is almost like the slide doc style that Nancy Duarte talks about. And so this it's got images, it's got drawings, and it's also got text, and it's a good takeaway, and it's, good information. It's almost like here's a summary of everything we talked about. And I think this is a really good summary handout that I saw. Kelly, if are you on the phone now? If you can pipe in.
I'm on the phone, but I missed your presentation on the on Doc's part. I had to jump in late. I was on another call for work.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
Thank you.
That's fine. But yeah, somebody mentioned earlier about reference materials. So Kelly did a really good job of referencing where she got all the information here. So that was a good one. So to justify, hey, here's the research I did. She did formal research. Mine was kind of informal. But here's all the reference information that she that she went through. Okay.
But I think part of that is for the fact that I'm in a medical background and we reference everything where I work. So I'm used to having to cite my resources, which is not something I had to do as much when I was in technical communication as you do in medical communication. So that kind of informed why I had an official reference list, whereas some people don't.
And that's a good point too. When you give a presentation, the speakers should kind of know their audience. And if you do have an audience of people who are expecting references, you better have the references ready. So I hope there's nobody in here expecting references from me, because the best I got is you seeing right here. Okay, so and not tooting Kelly's horn again here, but here's another one she did where she did one on how to create checklists. And if Nancy Duarte is the authority on presentations, I think Kelly's the authority on checklists. Every time she gives this progression on checklists, it's like swarms of people show up at her table, and at the end she gives a really good handout here. It's very colorful, it's very simple to follow, and it's really straight and to the point of how to create a checklist. And I thought this was a good handout as a takeaway from that. And I guess one of the last handouts I was going to mention is you don't have to create your own handout in some cases. If I'm going to do a presentation on how to use specific things in PowerPoint, if somebody who's never used PowerPoint before, and I need to show you all the cool little bells and whistles in PowerPoint to get you started, I can get a presentation from some other company or online that's already been made and hand out as a presentation, as a handout. You don't always have to create your own handouts if there's a really good one out there. And I can tell you right now, if you laminate this thing, people are going to drool over it. Okay. And I would be willing to bet there's a ninja hiding behind this thing. So there's probably a ninja in there somewhere. Okay.
Hey, Kelly, I just wanted to let you know I did use your handout. This is Vicki, and I did attend Kelly's special.
Oh, thank you.
And I did use your handout. That's awesome.
Thanks.
Cool. So I guess I'm echoing here. I guess one of the last things I want to bring up is what the point I was trying to make here is don't just print your slides out in any form whatsoever, whether it's 15 slides per page or 9 slides per page. Does anybody else hear me echoing? No, good.
I
not all presentations need handouts. And not all I said not all handouts need presentations. What I mean by it is not all handouts need slides. The type of presentation is going to dictate your type of handout. Plan what information should be in your handout, and plan when to put them out, before, after, or during. That is pretty much, I'm out of steam on that one. Anybody have any questions, suggestions, or comments? Because I'm sure there's lots of people out here that have great ideas on handouts that I have not touched on. Could everybody understand my Central New York accent? Yep. So Vicki, do we have any chat questions out there that we need to answer, or?
So we let's see. People answered your question that they could understand your not really from New York accent, and okay. Sorry about the echo, and I did have to mute a couple of people, but
okay.
We can try that again. Okay, let's see. I think we've covered all the questions in the chat. Let's tell people that you're now taking fresh questions. Oh, wait, we have a question from Pat.
Oh, somebody said changing the PowerPoint notes. Okay, we can do that. So I'll throw my last slide up here. So this is not the last slide. What I'll do is I'm gonna close out. You'll see a blue screen here in a second. Hang on just a second. Notes pages. So this is what it looks like for me. I created this. Now it does not look like the typical notes page that you see. Okay, and what I did here is the same thing that Rick Altman is to me the best reference on how to do this. But it's really easy to do. If you want to create a notes page, the default PowerPoint notes pages. I'll throw another example of a default PowerPoint notes page, and here we go. Here's what I did this past week. If I look at the notes pages here, and here's the default, they look like this. They're terrible. Okay. Well, you can turn that into this by simply going up here and editing the Notes Master. Okay. When you edit the Notes Master, you can actually change where and how big your slides are going to be, how big the text is going to be. You can go in, you can edit the font in the text. So if you have those who know the difference between serif and sans serif fonts, you want to use sans serif fonts for online screens on your presentation, but you want to use serif fonts if somebody's going to read it like a book. So you can change this to a serif type font. Those who don't know, it's ones with little feet on them, like Times New Roman. And you can set up your headers and footers and everything. And then when you're done, you close your Notes Master, and there it is. You can see where I had messed with mine. And you can just reapply the notes layout, and it changes the size of everything. I want to undo that one. But if you want to know how you do it with a different presentation like I did earlier, how do I do that? Hope I'm not going to bore anybody with this one, but we're going to play around on the notes page for a second. Is that okay, Vicki?
You got us.
Okay.
We can't wait.
All right, good. So we go. So what I do is first thing I do is I go to a Notes Master. Now I'll show you the notes page again. This is what they look like. Okay. This is the presentation I did this week. And there's my notes pages. Well, I want to make them look fancier. How long does it take to do? If I go to the Notes Master, I see the Notes Master. Well, I don't like the landscape orientation. I like portrait. Okay. So my notes page orientation, I like portrait. Okay. If I go back to look at my notes page, I already changed it to a portrait right there. I'll go back to my editing my Notes Master. If I want my header to go all the way across, I can just take it all the way across. And I don't care about the date. I can delete that. And I want my header to look fancy like Chuck's. So I come in, I just click the box here, and I can change my format the header to my shape fill. Put a gradient in here. Looks like a cute blue gradient. That's my blue gradient, right? I want my slide. When I looked at it, I saw the big picture of the slide. Well, I know what the slide looks like. I don't have to read that slide on this Notes Master. You can resize it, stick it in a corner somewhere. I can take my notes now. I can make them bigger. Make them really wide. And I like fancy colors on the bottom too. So I'll take this footer. I'll drag it all the way across the top, the bottom, and I will change the format of that one too. Anybody got a particular color they like? How about, if anybody has never played with the gradients, you do your gradient fill. You got 3 colors here. You can add or remove these colors, but let's say we want orangish and yellow. There you go. If I want to change this color to a more transparent color, you can do that. You close it. Now I got a cute header footer. And when I look at my Notes Master, I'll go back, and you're going to see something strange here for a second. You'll notice I don't see the header footer. And the reason why is I need to come in and insert the header footer, you'll notice they're unchecked here. When I check my header and footer, now they show up. Now when I come in, I want to type something, I can say title page. You know, I can't type. Now, and you go into the next pages, and you got your header footer there. At that point, now I can add way more text to here to support my, my slide. So this shows the slide, and I can actually put whatever I want to on this slide. And that's what I did with my other handouts. I just reformatted it, and I made my handout like this. I put my different logos up here. I can type what I want to. I put information about the webinar down at the bottom. I put my page numbers here, and I can control the look and feel of the handout. And now in that case, where the advantage comes in here is it does not look like a typical Microsoft Notes page. And the second thing is I can control the look and feel of it, and it goes with the PowerPoint. So when I come in here and I go back to view and go back to normal, that's my PowerPoint. So it's the same document. So that way I don't have to create two separate documents. I create a handout and I create my slides in the same document. And again, these handouts here were just for me, but if I were to hand these out in a presentation as a handout to give, then I would control what this says in here that would support these as opposed to what I'm supposed to say during the presentation. Anybody got any questions on that? Or if you, if anybody wants to, me help them create a handout, and you're at the STC New England Interchange this year, about 4 weeks from now, I'll be glad to help you with it. Or you, Jerry, I can help you tomorrow.
I thought that was a great demo. I definitely found things I did not know. So we have a little bit of a discussion in the chat box.
Okay.
So Chuck, can you see the chat box?
I can see the chat box.
Okay, so I'm starting with David at 2:17 p.m.
David, okay, David, as technical writers, it's important for us to advocate best practices because, here we go. Form technical communication.
So our presentation is technical communication. That's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. Yes, a presentation is definitely technical communication.
Janice says that she's expected to give handouts when she teaches software.
Yeah, and again, that's a good point. And also on David's point there, sorry to jump on to Janet right there, but on David's point right there, where the presentation is a form of technical communication. Some of the so-called experts I was reading about out there said that they think that you should hand out the notes pages, and the notes pages should be written in a conversational way. It depends to me. It depends on the presentation. If it is a technical presentation and you give it in a conversational way, how is the audience going to accept it? If it's a bunch of engineers, it's not going to be accepted well. They want data, period. Okay, it depends on who your audience is, but that's a good point. And also, when you said you got asked for handouts during a software presentation, what type of handouts were you asked for?
So that's Janice. Janice, do you want to elaborate? Okay, she's going to have to type to us, I think.
Yeah, David just mentioned that the worst presentations are the ones that are given by directors who rely on the slides to convey the entire presentation. That is so true. I was actually watching a YouTube video from Rick Altman, and somebody had asked him, how do you get the people in the upper management to understand that you can't just put paragraphs upon paragraphs of text on the slides and expect people to call that a presentation? And he agrees. He's like, what can you do? All you can do is just keep pushing at them and saying, look, nobody's paying attention to your stuff. You know, I hate to say it, you know, so you know, don't, you know, try to make your handouts as good as your presentations, and try to make really good presentations.
So Janice did just type in the chat box that her students want step-by-step instructions.
Okay, good. And there's step-by-step instructions, probably how to do something in the software. Because a lot of times we do that for our LMS, where you actually do it online. I mean, some of these YouTube videos are outstanding for how to do stuff. Cool. All right.
So Janice says, I'm a minimalist and I don't include a lot of discussion. I'm assuming she means in her handouts. Also, she gets asked a lot for handouts for our other classes.
And so Janice, when they ask for the handouts, are they looking for a particular type of handout other than the step-by-step instructions, or are they just wanting a handout, just to want a handout? Oh, they just mainly the step-by-step instructions. Okay. Because you know, I've given handouts when I've done like technical training classes, and believe it or not, I'd say 50%, if not more, when they walk out the door, the handouts go in the trash can as they're walking out the door. Why? Because we're expected to give them, and we hand them out, and we know that what's going to happen to them. We hand them out. You know, so. Hopefully, we can get the expectation down that, like I mentioned earlier, not every presentation requires a handout. But if you're going to give a handout, have a purpose for it. And yeah, if you're running at a crunch and you feel like you just have to print your slides, just give them your slides at the end of the presentation, but don't call it a handout, please. Oh, I didn't have a kitty cat either, so sorry about not having a kitty cat in my presentation.
Well, the cat bonnet.
We did have the cat bonnet, so we did have a kitty cat. You're right.
We're good.
Okay. Okay. So again, if anybody wants any more detail about how to do the slide notes master and edit that to make a decent handout, feel free to ask. Come to me. Or if you're like I say, if you're lucky enough, like Kelly is, to go to the presentation summit down in Clearwater that Rick Altman runs, that's like to me that's like a presenter's dream conference, because there's going to be a lot of good speakers down there. All right.
So Chuck, we have some conversation in the chat box. Robert Hirschenau says, Chuck, thanks for breaking down these complex questions. It really depends on the subject matter and the audience, and we need to analyze what that means each time. Good point.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, if you give a presentation on a topic to one audience, that same presentation given to a totally different audience could require a totally different handout. Yep.
David says maybe instead of giving a handout containing notes, what we should give the audience is an important key takeaway. For example, a quick reference card, like you talked about earlier, and everyone can use when I return to the office. And Marianne says, do you have any comparison of the retention user rate if you distribute the handouts electronically?
That's a good question, Mary. I do not, but I can tell you right now, if I'm given a handout electronically, like if it's on a thumb drive, first thing I do is get the thumb drive, see what's on there. I pick out the things I like, the things I don't like, I save off onto my own computer, and I wipe the thumb drive and I use it for something else. If that answers that question. And here's one other thing I thought was interesting. I was doing a train-to-trainer, and I was teaching some of my workers how to do presentations. And one of them, instead of handing out procedures or steps when she did her presentation, she handed out chunks of clay. That's her handout. And we looked at her kind of funny, and her presentation was how to make a doll face. And her handouts was clay. And we made a doll face before the end of the presentation, during the presentation. So handouts don't always have to be paper printed. It can be toys.
That's cool. So
Yep.
Jamie Sagan says that this is great info. Chuck, thanks. She can use this info immediately.
That's good. I appreciate it. And Marianne, you said, do I find out refer to those files after I've downloaded them to my computer? Yes, I do, because the only ones I download to my computer are the ones that I might find useful. In a lot of cases, those are, of all things, step by step on how to use certain softwares, like Adobe softwares. They can be quick references. They can be whatever. Yes, I do use those. If I'm not going to use it, I end up deleting it. Okay, anybody? Got a David asking a suggestion about making handouts 508 compliant. I guess unfortunately for me, I've never run across having to do that. Maybe I should. That is something I should be thinking about. Has anybody else ever had to do a 508 compliant handout?
Do you see the question?
Mm-hmm. A 508 well, David, you might have to answer the 508 compliant handout better than I could. That's the one. Is that like the ADA type stuff?
Yeah, Marianne says it's the accessibility standard is section 508.
Yeah, I mean it would. That's a good point. I've never run across that situation where we had to do that.
So that would be an electronic handout, right, David?
Yeah, well, and if it's to me, it's like if it's something where somebody's visually impaired or something like that, could you do it where you have a handout that's audio file on a thumb drive of your handouts? That's a good point. So that to me, that would be a good example of a good handout. If somebody needs an audio file of your handout, could you create that? I know there's text-to-speech software out there, or you can record your audio yourself, hopefully with somebody who's got a more neutral accent. Yep.
We love your accent.
Thanks. Okay, cool. Yeah, I see a lot of questions coming in, so we'll keep answering. Whoever wants to stay online, well, I can keep answering them because Anybody else got any other awesome handout examples? Let me know because I need to improve my handouts too. I think we can all improve.
So Jesse has got a comment that many applications now include a feature that'll make screen reader version, or at least take your version and improve it for screen reading.
Oh, really? You said it's software that does that? You know what type of software it is, or which software it is?
I don't know. I don't know a lot of the details. I'm sorry. I've just barely read a little bit about it, but I think that Adobe is starting to incorporate that into several of their products.
Okay. I didn't know that. And Marcy, you wanted to use emojis?
Well, that way I didn't have to unmute, and I could tell you I was really enjoying your humor and your presentation style.
I appreciate it.
There was no falling asleep with this. Kept my mind going the whole time.
I just hope everybody got something out of it. Again, I've created some of the worst handouts I've ever seen, and I've created some I'm kind of happy with. and it all depends on the audience, and all depends on whether or not I got lucky enough to make one that's useful that day. So, yep. But the thing about it is you got to know your audience too. So, all right.
All right. So people are starting to type thank yous in the chat box. I think it's time for a round of applause for Chuck.
Oh, thanks. Thanks everybody for taking your time and an hour out of your day. So hopefully you can come out with better handouts and or either give me suggestions on how to improve some of mine.
Great.
Yep.
All right. I'm going to stop the recording.